Section 4.1, we're going to look at how to take some samples and do surveys. All right, so anytime we are trying to do a study, we have a population of interest, okay? It could be small, like our AP Stats class, or it could be larger, like every high school senior in the country, all right? But we have some population that we're trying to find some information about. If we were to do a census, that would mean we'd have to get data from every single person in our population. So if it was our AP Stats class, we could probably get every single person to answer our questions. If it was every high school senior in the country, there's no chance we could contact every single one of them. So we'd be looking at something called a sample, which is just a smaller portion of our population. All right, so out of our big population, we take a small sample and we use data from that sample to give us some information. We're going to make an inference about the population as a whole based on our sample data. Okay, so we want to make sure that you can identify that. So here we have a quality control manager is going to take 10 monitors from the production line every hour and inspect them for any defects. So what is our population and our sample? The population in this case is all of them that are produced in that hour, all right? And then the sample is the 10 that we pull off the line to test. Okay, so if we want, we're going to take a sample of people to answer some questions. We want that sample to be what we call representative, which means that it is roughly the same as our population, so it'll give us good information, okay? If we sample poorly, we could end up with bias, okay? And so some things that we want to make sure we know. Bias is not just bad luck, we'll call it, in one sample. So, if we take a sample of 20 people and we end up just by random chance to have those 20 people all have the same opinion, that's not necessarily bias. It happens rarely, but as long as we chose our sample in a good way, that's not bias. Bias is also not people's answers. Okay, so if we take a sample and the people in our study decide that they hate left-handed people and say left-handed people should not be allowed to hold public office, right? That's a bias of our respondents. It's not bias in our study. Okay, their opinions are their opinions. When we're talking about bias, we're talking about the way that we designed our study or chose our sample. Okay, so some ways that we can mess this up. If we just pick who is easiest to contact, that would be what is called a convenience sample. Okay, so if we want to know how long students take to do their homework, we go to the library, we ask the first 30 people in the library, boom, there's our sample. Okay, what might be an issue with this? And when we describe bias, we got to say two things. We have to say how those people might be a little bit different than the population at large, and we have to indicate the direction of the bias, okay? Is our sample going to overestimate or underestimate compared to the rest of the population? Okay, so when we're talking about those students in the library, Part 1, describe how they might be different. Students who are hanging out in the library are probably a little bit more serious about school than others, okay? So if we use them as our sample, number 2, that will overestimate the amount of time that is spent on homework by all students at the school. All right, another example of bad sampling, okay, is something called voluntary response sampling. So that's when we allow people to choose whether or not they want to respond. So, if we have a poll on the internet or we throw a QR code up on the wall, and we're not picking who's responding, people choose to respond, okay? Usually if someone chooses to participate in a survey like that, they probably have some pretty strong feelings about what we're talking about. If I put a QR code up on the wall, like fill out my fantasy football survey, and you have never watched a football game in your life, you're probably not going to fill that out, right? Whereas someone who plays fantasy football is going to, and so my sample is going to be skewed in that instance. All right, so those are some things not to do. What should we do? How do we sample well? All right, and what we want to do is we want to use chance. We're going to do simple random sampling, all right, so that we aren't using favoritism when we're selecting and people aren't self-selecting, okay? So random sample means we're using a chance process. Specifically, a simple random sample is a sample of size n. So let's say I'm going to choose 5 students from our AP Stat class. I have to choose them. My random process has to be done in a way that every group of 5 people that I could possibly make out of our class has an equal chance to be selected. So ways that we can do this, and you are going to have to not only do this, but be able to look at a scenario and explain how you would do it. All right, so there's 3 different ways that we're going to look at. First would be technology, some sort of random number generator. All right, so first thing we got to do is label the population, give everybody a number. Use a random number generator to get however many, if our sample size is 5, different numbers. Okay, and then those are our people. Okay, the second way is using something called a table of random digits. All right, this is kind of old school. There's literally books and charts of just random numbers, and you read through the random numbers. Okay, so we're going to label our population like before, but the key here is we have to use the same number of digits. So if I have 12 people, then I can't do just 1 through 12. I have to do 0, 1, 0, 2, because 10 and 11 and 12 have 2 digits. The same case if I had like over 100 members of my population, I would have to do 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 2, because each person has to have the same number of digits. And then we're going to look at a table of random digits, and we just read across the line. And if we're doing 2-digit numbers, we're pulling them 2 at a time. If we do 3-digit numbers, we're pulling them 3 at a time. We're going to ignore anything that's not in our list and anything that's a repeat. So we'll do an example of this so that you can see, and then those would be our numbers. So here we have a list of 28 hotels, and we want a simple random sample of 4 of them. Okay, again, because we have double digits, we labeled these ones 0, 1, 0, 2. So everything is a 2-digit number. Okay, and then here is what a line from that table looks like. These breaks don't mean anything. They're just there to help you like not be able to have to look at so many numbers in a row and stay organized. So because our population is numbered in 2-digit numbers, we are going to look at 2 digits at a time. So like 69 was the first 2 digits, 0, 5, and then 1, 6. Okay, so this is not like a space that we skip. It's just to help so you're not looking at this really long line of numbers. Okay, so to choose our sample now, all right, 69, I don't have 69 people in our population, so that number is irrelevant, skip it. All right, 5, Beach Castle is now part of our sample. All right, 16, we have a 16, so Radisson is part of our sample. We don't have a 48, so we're going to skip that. Okay, we do have a 17, so Ramada is part of our sample. And then we continue down the list. 87 is not on our list. 17 is a repeat. Okay, that doesn't mean Ramada gets in my sample twice. It means I just skip it. 40 is not in, 95 is not in, 17 is a repeat again. So we got to skip all the way down to 20. All right, and that's the next number that's in my population up here. So that means C Club is my 4th hotel that's going to be a part of my sample. Okay, and then the last method is something called the hat method. It's basically something you've probably done before. You write the names or the numbers of the population on pieces of paper. We put them in some container, mix them all up, and then choose out however many is going to be in our sample size. Okay, the key here when you're describing this is you have to say that they are identical slips of paper so that the person reading your answer knows that you know we're giving everyone the same chance because the papers are all the same. Okay, so there's a couple other random methods that we might use that are a little bit more complicated than simple random sampling. One of those is called a stratified random sample. And so strata are groups. All right, so in our population, if we have some groups that are pretty similar, we might want to pick a couple people from each group to make sure that our sample doesn't heavily overrepresent one group or the other. Okay. So for example, here's my population. Let's say it's Patriot High School, and some strata that would make sense for Patriot is grade level. So I would have my, my ninth graders, my 10th graders, my 11th graders, my 12th graders. And then from each strata, I'm going to pick a random sample so that in my final sample, I have equal representation of all 4 grades in the school. Okay. Another method is called a cluster sample. All right. And so this usually happens if our clusters are pretty similar, but there's some issues with how they are spread out, that picking people that are all close to each other might help me save some time and some money. All right. So if we did, for example, let's say like streets in a neighborhood. Okay, if all of the houses in the neighborhood are pretty similar, then each street is probably pretty close to representative of the entire neighborhood. So I could pick, a couple different streets and do everybody on the street. Whereas if I did like a simple random sample, I might be having to walk all over the neighborhood, all right, or pay somebody to walk all over the neighborhood. And we might not want to do that to save some time and money. Okay. The other thing some other things that we want to make sure we occur, some other sources of bias, all right? Undercoverage is when we have some members of the population that are less likely or simply cannot be chosen. Okay, for example, if I did a poll by selecting landline phone numbers, then anybody that only has a cell phone or doesn't have a phone at all cannot be a part of my sample, so that I have undercoverage there. We could have something called non-response. All right, this is where people either don't want to answer us. We call their landline phone and they're like, stop bothering me, and hang up. Or the way we designed our study. So if I am calling people between the hours of 10 a.m. and 1 p.m., anybody that's out at work is not going to be able to answer their phone and be part of my survey. All right, and then the last one is response bias. And this typically has to do with the way we word questions or sometimes how we ask them. So if I am asking somebody in person, how many red lights have you run in the last 3 months? They might not want to tell me the answer, right? They might be embarrassed to admit to running a red light or admit that they don't wash their hands after they go to the bathroom. Whereas if it was anonymous on paper or on the internet where they know like their name isn't, they're not having to look at another person and say, no, I don't wash my hands, they might be a little bit more likely to be honest. All right, and that is it for 4.1.